I'd like everyone to meet Bethany Cross, who has quietly run my calendar, my correspondence, and, let's be honest, and half my decisions for the last 3 years.
The ice sculpture at the center of the room was shaped like the Halbrook Logistics logo. A stylized compass rose, slowly weeping onto white linen as 300 guests filled the ballroom of the Charlotte Marriott Marquis. 20 years of the company's history hung in banners along the walls. String lights, a 12-piece band. Warren Doyle Halbrook III had spent $40,000 making sure tonight would be unforgettable. He had no idea how right he was. Margaret Coulson sat 2 chairs down from her husband at the executive table, in the same plain gray dress she'd worn to the last 4 company functions, her hands folded in her lap the way they always were in rooms like this. Small, still, unremarkable. She was watching the ice sculpture drip and thinking, absurdly, about how her mother used to say that nothing beautiful lasts if nobody protects it. Warren stood, tapped his champagne flute with a fork. The band went quiet mid-note. "I want to say something," he announced, "about the people who make success possible." Margaret felt her stomach tighten before she understood why. 11 years of marriage teaches you to read a man's throat clearing, the way sailors read weather. "For over a decade," Warren said, and his eyes swept the room with the practiced warmth of a man who had rehearsed this in a mirror. "I've had a partner by my side, a woman who has quietly, tirelessly," a pause, a small smile, "done absolutely nothing, while I built this company from a regional shipping outfit into a $400 million logistics empire." Laughter. Uncertain. Scattered. The kind that comes from people who aren't sure yet if they're allowed to laugh. Margaret doesn't work. Margaret doesn't network. Margaret has never once asked me a real question about my day, because I don't think she's ever understood what I actually do. He reached into his jacket and produced a thin manila envelope, and set it down beside her bread plate as gently as if it were a gift. So I thought, what better night than tonight, with everyone who matters to me in one room, to finally let her go find out what a real day's work feels like. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Margaret could feel 300 pairs of eyes deciding whether to look at her or away from her. "Divorce papers," Warren said, "for the people in the back. Signed on my end already." He turned and gestured toward a young woman in a red dress, standing near the edge of the room, her face gone the color of the tablecloth. "I'd also like everyone to meet Bethany Cross, who has quietly run my calendar, my correspondence, and, let's be honest, half my decisions for the last 3 years. It's time I stopped pretending otherwise." Bethany did not smile. She did not wave. She stood very still, staring at the floor, and Margaret, even in that moment, even with her own humiliation blooming hot across her collarbone, noticed that the younger woman looked less like a mistress unveiled, and more like a rabbit that had just heard the trap spring. Warren leaned down, close enough that only the nearest tables could hear. "You spent 10 years living off my name," he said. "You'll last a month before you're calling my lawyer begging for alimony. I hope it was worth it." Margaret looked down at the envelope, then up at her husband, really looked at him, the way you look at a stranger's face trying to place where you've seen it before. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I don't recognize you anymore. I'm not sure I ever did." She reached out and folded her hands over the papers, calm as a woman closing a book she'd already finished. She stood, smoothed the front of her dress. "I hope you still enjoy coming into work on Monday," she said. Then she picked up her purse and walked out of that ballroom, spine straight, heels even on the marble, while Warren Halbrook laughed behind her. A man who had just humiliated a woman he had no idea was, at that exact hour, 6 weeks into a private, forensic investigation of the very company whose payroll he was standing on. Before we go further, if you're the kind of viewer who loves watching the quiet ones finally get their due, hit subscribe here on Danny Tales TV, because Margaret Coulson's story is only getting started, and I promise you have not guessed where it ends. To understand how much was actually lost that night, you have to go back nearly 12 years, to a supply chain conference in a Charlotte hotel not far from the one where the marriage would eventually end. Margaret was 29 then, sharper edged than the woman she'd later become, still new enough to money that she hadn't yet learned to hide it well. She was there under her maiden name Coulson, representing a routing analytics firm nobody in the room had heard of, standing awkwardly by a coffee station in a blazer she'd bought specifically for the trip. Warren Halbrook, 31, already running his father's trucking outfit into something bigger, reached past her for a stirrer, and knocked his coffee straight down the front of her blazer. "Oh God, I am so sorry," he said, already grabbing napkins, dabbing uselessly at her sleeve, while she stood there laughing despite herself. "I promise I'm not usually this much of a disaster. Let me buy you a new blazer. Let me buy you a new conference. Honestly, I think I've ruined this one for you. It's coffee, not a crime," she'd said, "though I am going to smell like a Starbucks for the rest of the panel. Then let me at least buy you dinner as an apology. I have to make it up to you somehow. My mother raised me better than this." They talked for 3 hours that night in a hotel bar, and Margaret, who had spent her 20s learning that most men either wanted her money or wanted nothing to do with a woman who understood freight margins better than they did, found something rare in Warren back then. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He laughed easily. He remembered small things she mentioned only once. On their 3rd date, he drove 2 hours out of his way to bring her soup when she had the flu, and sat on the floor of her apartment reading her old college textbooks out loud in silly voices, until she stopped coughing long enough to laugh. She fell in love with that man, the one who noticed things, the one who, in the early years, used to sit across from her at their kitchen table after long days and ask, genuinely, "What's the hardest part of your work right now?" and listen to the answer like it mattered. She never told him about Coulson Analytics, not because she planned to deceive him forever, but because in the beginning, she was terrified of what it would do to the way he looked at her. She had grown up watching her father, a machinist, grow smaller and more silent every time her mother's careful bookkeeping outperformed his overtime. She had promised herself, long before she ever met Warren, that if she ever fell in love, it would be with a man who chose her before he knew what she was worth, not after. So she let him believe she dabbled in consulting. She restructured her holdings through Bellwether Capital, hired Denise Clark to run the public-facing side of things, and quietly, deliberately disappeared from her own success. For a few years, it didn't matter. They were happy in the plain, unglamorous way that doesn't make for good stories. Sunday mornings with bad coffee and the newspaper, a shared joke about the neighbor's dog, Warren's hand finding hers under restaurant tables without either of them thinking about it. The change didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most things do, a slow erosion so gradual neither of them marked the exact day the water finally won. It started, if Margaret had to name a beginning, around year 6, right after Halbrook Logistics nearly collapsed during a credit crunch that gutted half the mid-sized freight carriers in the Southeast. Warren had come home gray-faced for weeks, and Margaret, without telling him, had quietly moved money through Bellwether to shore up a lending facility that would otherwise have called in the company's loans. She'd done it to save him, not the company. He never knew. He simply woke up one Tuesday to a call from his CFO saying the crisis had passed, and he decided, the way ambitious men often decide when they need a story that flatters them, that he'd saved the company through his own force of will. After that, something in him hardened. He stopped asking what the hardest part of her day was. He started introducing her at parties as, "My better half, she keeps the home fires burning," in a tone that made home fires sound like a diagnosis. He began coming home later. He began, without ever quite admitting it to himself, treating his wife the way he treated furniture he'd stopped noticing was there. Margaret told herself it was stress. She told herself it was a phase. She kept loving the man who used to read to her on the floor, because some part of her still believed he was in there, buried under the newer, colder version standing in his place. She was wrong, but it would take a ballroom and a dinner plate to prove it to her. Margaret didn't call Denise the night of the gala expecting to buy anything. She called because Denise Clark was the only person alive who knew the truth about who she was, and because she needed, more than anything, to say the words out loud to someone who wouldn't flinch. "He announced it in front of everyone," she said, sitting alone in her kitchen still in her gray dress. "Divorce papers on my dinner plate, Denise. And a woman. 3 years, apparently." "I'll kill him," Denise said, with the flat calm of someone who meant it only 60% figuratively. "Do you want me to come over?" "No, I want you to help me think." Margaret pressed her palm flat against the cool granite of the counter, grounding herself. "I need to understand something first, before I decide anything else. I need to know what kind of man he's actually been, not to me, to the company, to the people who work for him. You think there's something there. I think a man who could do that to me without blinking has probably done smaller versions of it to other people for years, where nobody was watching." She exhaled. I don't want revenge, Denise. I want to know the truth. Can you get someone? Quietly. No connection to Bellwether anyone could trace. To just look. Not to buy anything. Just to look. Denise brought in a small forensic firm out of Atlanta the following week. 3 investigators who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet corporate archaeology, digging through public filings, court records, state and corporation databases, and a careful, deniable network of former employee interviews conducted under the cover of an unrelated industry survey. It took nearly a month before the first real thread surfaced, and Margaret spent that month in a strange, suspended state, going to yoga, sorting through which furniture was legally hers, sitting across from divorce attorneys who had no idea the quiet woman in front of them could have bought their firm, while, underneath all of it, a much larger question sat unanswered. The first report came back frustratingly thin. Halbrook Logistics looked, on paper, like a fairly ordinary mid-sized company under some financial strain, but nothing criminal. Margaret nearly let it go. She told Denise as much over coffee one Thursday. "Maybe it's just a marriage that went wrong," she said. "Maybe I don't need there to be a bigger villain story underneath it to justify how much this hurts." "Maybe," Denise agreed, "but give it 2 more weeks." The lead investigator flagged something in the vendor filings she wants to run down, a P.O. box that keeps showing up somewhere it shouldn't. 2 weeks later, everything changed. The P.O. box led to a shell consulting firm registered to Diane Pemberton, Warren's sister. From there, the thread unspooled fast. A compensation committee chaired by Roger Pemberton, Warren's brother-in-law, a procurement department run by Ted Halbrook, Warren's cousin, a pattern of promotions for a junior employee named Bethany Cross that tracked suspiciously with budget favors Warren had requested from managers who reported to him. Margaret sat with the full report for 3 days before she called Denise back. "I want to buy it," she said. "Not to hurt him, to find out how deep it goes, and to fix it if it's as bad as this looks." "Then we need to move carefully," Denise said, "because I have to tell you something you're not going to love. Halbrook Logistics isn't just sitting there waiting to be bought. The board's been quietly shopping the company for months. Their debt covenants are getting tighter, and there's already interest. A private equity shop out of Charlotte called Ridgeline Partners has been circling for weeks. If they smell a competing bid, they could push a faster, dirtier offer just to win, and Ridgeline has a reputation for gutting companies for parts. If they win this, there's no cleanup, there's no reform, there's just liquidation, and every person in that whistleblower file loses their job twice. So we move first. We move smart, quietly, through Bellwether, with a structure the board won't immediately connect to you. But Margaret, I need you to understand the risk. If Warren or anyone on that board so much as suspects his soon-to-be ex-wife is behind an offer, the whole thing collapses, and worse, he gets a chance to bury the evidence before anyone with actual authority ever sees it." The negotiation that followed was not the clean, 6-hour transaction Margaret had once imagined in the abstract. It took 11 weeks. Twice, the board's lead negotiator, a brusque, skeptical man named Alistair Kwan, nearly walked away from Bellwether's offer, convinced the mystery buyer behind the holding company was hiding something worse than Ridgeline's blunt liquidation plan. "You're asking us to sell to a shell company. We can't even get on a phone call with the actual principal," Kwan told Denise during one particularly tense session. "Ridgeline at least shows their face. Ridgeline will strip this company for parts inside 18 months, Denise said. "You know that. Your own employees know that." "Maybe. But at least I know who's steering the ship." For 3 days, the deal nearly died. Ridgeline raised its offer by 6%, and 2 board members, who'd been quietly lobbied by Roger Pemberton, protecting, Margaret would later learn, his own compromised position, pushed hard to accept it. Margaret sat awake at 2 in the morning on the 3rd night, seriously considering whether to reveal herself to the board directly, whether the risk of Warren finding out early was worth saving the deal. It was Denise, in the end, who found the lever. She quietly arranged for Kwan to review, under strict confidentiality, with names redacted, a summary of the whistleblower and compliance concerns the investigators had already surfaced, framed simply as material risk factors any responsible acquirer should be aware of before closing. She didn't say Bellwether had dug them up. She let the board discover, on their own, that Ridgeline's team hadn't even bothered to look. Kwan called an emergency session. 2 days later, the board voted, 7-3, to accept Bellwether Capital's offer over Ridgeline's higher bid. Persuaded not by loyalty, but by the sudden, uncomfortable realization that their own company might be sitting on a landmine Ridgeline had no intention of ever safely defusing. The papers were signed on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret Coulson, through 5 careful layers of holding structure, became the sole owner of Halbrook Logistics. 6 hours before her husband stood up at a company gala and threw divorce papers on her dinner plate, congratulating himself on getting rid of dead weight. She had not planned the timing. She would later tell Denise it felt less like an act of God and more like a period, arriving at the exact end of a sentence that had been writing itself for 11 years. The woman in the red dress did not fit the story Margaret had built in her head. Bethany Cross was 26, the daughter of a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs in Gastonia to put her through community college, and she had come to Halbrook Logistics 4 years earlier as a receptionist earning $15 an hour, terrified of losing the first stable job she'd ever had. Warren Halbrook had noticed her within her first month. Not, at first, romantically, but the way a man notices a tool he intends to use. He complimented her instincts. He asked her opinion on decisions no one else asked her opinion on. He told her, quietly, in her 2nd year, that she was wasted answering phones, and had her transferred to his own office within the month. By her 3rd year, she was staying late, helping him prep for board meetings, and somewhere in that overtime, in the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped trying at home, and a young woman who had never once in her life been told by someone powerful that she mattered, it became something else. Bethany told herself, for a long time, that it wasn't really an affair, that Warren's marriage was already over in every way that counted, that she was simply loved by someone who saw her, finally, for the first time. She did not know, until the night of the gala, that Warren intended to use her as a prop in his own humiliation of his wife. She had believed, in the deluded, half-formed way people believe what they need to, that the divorce announcement would be private, a quiet conversation, not a public spectacle with her standing exposed at the edge of a ballroom, while 300 strangers turned to look at her like she was the punchline of somebody else's joke. She had gone home that night and cried for reasons she couldn't fully name, and the discomfort she felt curdled slowly, over the following weeks, into something closer to doubt. Margaret never sought her out for cruelty. When the investigation into Bethany's promotions came back, real work she'd done alongside promotions she plainly hadn't earned, Margaret insisted the internal review treat her as what she actually was, a young woman who had been elevated by a man with power over her entire career, and who had accepted what was offered without asking hard enough questions about why. She's not innocent, Margaret told Denise. She knew he was married. She stood in a room and let him humiliate his wife in front of everyone, and didn't say a word. That's real, and it has consequences, but there's a difference between being unkind in your private life and committing fraud, and I'm not going to let my own hurt collapse those into the same thing. The formal offer that eventually went to Bethany wasn't a punishment. It was a demotion back to a real role, at a real level, with real accountability. The corner office, and the invented title gone, but a door left open if she wanted to actually build something honest. Bethany declined it. According to the HR representative who delivered the news, she went very quiet when the offer was explained, and then asked one question, whether it was true there had been someone before her. There hadn't been, not exactly, but the representative told her honestly that Warren had spent 3 years lying to a wife who was, by every account, decent to him, and that a man capable of that kind of sustained deception had shown her something about his character worth thinking about. Bethany took the neutral reference. She resigned. She never spoke to Warren again, not out of strategy, but because the moment his power evaporated, so did the entire foundation of what she'd mistaken for love. It hadn't been Warren she wanted. It had been the feeling of being chosen. And a disgraced man under federal review had nothing left to offer that feeling at all. Warren, in the weeks after the gala, was not a man in retreat. He believed, with the specific confidence of someone who has never once been meaningfully told no, that he had won. He'd expected Margaret to fight the divorce, to demand alimony, to make things ugly and expensive. Instead, her attorney sent back a settlement so clean and so fast it barely registered as a negotiation. She asked for nothing beyond what was legally owed her, took none of the marital home, and signed everything within a week. Warren took this, predictably, as proof of his own theory, that she'd never had any leverage to begin with, that she was simply a woman with nowhere else to go, cutting her losses quietly. He threw a small celebration with a few executives the following Friday. "To freedom," he toasted, and told the table, not entirely joking, that divorcing Margaret had been the best business decision he'd made all year, cheaper than he'd feared, faster than he'd hoped, and with Bethany finally able to be seen publicly on his arm. 2 weeks after that, came the email announcing the sale of Halbrook Logistics to new ownership, and Warren's confidence, if anything, deepened. He told his direct reports he'd heard things about the new owner being an unusually generous, hands-off investor, a rumor he'd manufactured almost entirely from wishful thinking, and he began quietly angling for a promotion, certain that new ownership would want an aggressive, results-driven executive like himself running point on the transition. He bought a new suit for the all-staff meeting. He told Bethany before she'd resigned that this was probably going to mean a bigger title, maybe a seat at the leadership table. He had no idea, walking into that auditorium with his chest out and his hair freshly cut, that he was about to experience the second worst morning of his life, in the same room where he'd spent weeks telling people the first one, his divorce, had been a triumph. CEO Grant Whitfield walked out first, thanked the room for its patience, and introduced Margaret Coulson as the new owner of Halbrook Logistics. Margaret watched recognition spread through the crowd like a wave breaking in slow motion, and watched Warren's face specifically, the exact half-second where confusion gave way to something close to vertigo. She did not look at him again for a long while. She told the room calmly and without a single mention of her marriage, what the investigation had found. The Shell consulting firm, the deleted whistleblower complaint, the pattern of favors and promotions running straight through Warren's division. She spoke to the 12 people who had left the company after raising honest concerns, told them plainly they had been right, and that the door was open if they ever wanted to come back. Warren shot to his feet exactly as she'd expected he would, exactly as his pride had guaranteed he would since the day she'd met him. "This is a personal vendetta," he shouted. "This woman is my ex-wife. She bought this company to destroy me." For one dangerous moment, the room hesitated, because they had, many of them, heard whispers of the gala, and the accusation landed with a certain terrible logic. "Everything on these slides is documented," Margaret said, not raising her voice. "It exists whether you like either of us or not. Look at the documents and decide for yourselves." Then, because he had demanded it publicly, she gave him one last direct answer, and only one. "You didn't lose everything because you left me, Warren. You lost it because of what you were doing in this building for years, in the dark, while I still believed I'd married a decent man. The divorce is just how I found out who you actually were. I only turned on the lights." He looked around the auditorium for a single ally. There was none. He walked out through the back doors, and this time, there was no coming back from it, no rumor to spin, no story he could tell that would survive the paper trail, now sitting on 300 laptops. It would have been a cleaner story if Warren's collapse had been immediate and total. It wasn't. For nearly 2 months after the all-staff meeting, he hired an aggressive attorney and mounted a genuine fight, filing a defamation threat against the company, leaking a self-serving account to a local business blogger, and quietly courting Roger Pemberton's cooperation in painting the whole investigation as a vindictive smear campaign by a scorned ex-wife who'd manufactured a corporate scandal out of an ordinary divorce. For a brief, tense stretch, it almost worked. The blog post gained some traction. A minor local news outlet ran a skeptical piece questioning whether the new billionaire owner had used her resources to unfairly target her ex-husband, and Warren, buoyed by the coverage, told friends he expected the whole thing to blow over within the month, that Margaret would eventually settle quietly to avoid a protracted PR fight. It was Roger Pemberton's own cooperation in the end that ended it. Facing the deletion logs tied directly to his administrator account, Roger broke during his formal review and, in trying to save himself, corroborated everything: the Shell firm, the falsified quarterly report, and Warren's direct knowledge of both. His statement, combined with the auditor's record of Warren's false testimony under the formal review, was referred to state investigators within the week. The defamation threat evaporated. The blogger quietly deleted his post. The last of Warren's allies stopped returning his calls. 3 weeks after that, Warren called her. "Margaret, I need, please, just 5 minutes. Everything's falling apart. Bethany's gone. My sister won't speak to me. There's talk of actual charges. His voice cracked in a way she hadn't heard since the early years, on the floor of her apartment, reading to her when she was sick. "You're the only one who can help me now. A word from you. I'm not going to make it go away," Margaret said quietly. "I couldn't, even if I wanted to. But I wouldn't, even if I could. The people you pushed out of that building didn't have anyone to make their consequences disappear. So this is my punishment for leaving you." "No," she said, and meant it with her whole chest. "If you'd left me honestly, I'd have wished you well, and walked away, and you'd have kept everything. You didn't lose your life because you left me, Warren. You lost it because of who you'd already become before I ever found out." She paused. "I hope you find your way through this. The hard way, not the one where someone else makes it disappear." She ended the call, and sat for a long time afterward at her kitchen counter, not crying, feeling instead something quieter and cleaner than she'd expected, the particular relief of a door finally fully closed. Margaret rebuilt Halbrook Logistics slowly, deliberately, the way you rebuild anything worth keeping. An independent whistleblower office no single administrator could touch. Real promotions for real work. Personal calls to all 12 names on her list, Alicia Farrow, who cried on the phone for an hour, certain until that moment she'd imagined the whole thing. Curtis Boyd, who came back and, on his first day, was met personally in the lobby and told his deleted complaint had been permanently restored to the record. A year later, the company was written up in 3 separate trade journals, not as a scandal, but as a case study in honest repair. When a reporter finally asked her, gently, about her former marriage, Margaret gave the only answer she ever gave. "I won't discuss it. But I'll say this much. For a long time I thought hiding what I'd built was a form of humility. It wasn't. It was fear, wearing humility's clothes. You don't need a fortune to stop making yourself small for someone who was never really looking at you. You just have to decide to stop." She kept, in the corner of her new office, the same battered folding table from her first apartment near Ohio State. The one she'd taught herself to code on. The one that had outlasted a marriage, a company, and every version of herself she'd ever had to become to survive one. Visitors sometimes asked why. She always gave them the same answer. "It reminds me who I was before anyone ever tried to tell me who I wasn't." There is a version of this story that ends in revenge, and it would have been satisfying, in its own small way, but Margaret Coulson had been offered that story 3 separate times, in a conference room, on a stage, on one last phone call, and 3 separate times, she'd chosen something harder and quieter instead. Not the woman who got even. The woman who, once, on the worst night of her life, folded a set of divorce papers with steady hands, and never once let herself become small again.